All right, hello everybody, and welcome. I've got something a little kind of surprisingly interesting today. I'm back. I'm back looking at kind of old, late 19th century horror, and this was actually I found this because there was a video by Liminal Spaces. You might remember him as the guy who kind of pointed me in the direction of The Willows a while back. He has another video that came out a couple weeks ago where he talks about a book by a guy named Marcel Schwob, a French guy who died in 1905. And in, I guess, 1892, he wrote a book called The King in the Golden Mask. And this was several years, approximately 3 years before the King in Yellow came out. So this is actually kind of interesting. It's a weird coincidence kind of thing going on, which I thought was kind of interesting. And like The King in Yellow, it's a combination of a bunch of short stories, but it's also a very different book from The King in Yellow. And so Marcel Schwob was I guess they call him a surrealist writer. He wrote a bunch in the 1890s, and he died very young in 1905. The particular book that I'm looking at was published in 1982, translated by Ian White. The book, Marcel Schwab's stuff is in the public domain in the original French, but unfortunately in English it has only been translated fairly recently as far as I can tell. So that's kind of a little bit of a downer, but there is a version that you can borrow on the archive that I'll point toward. So this 1982 book is not just The King in the Golden Mask, but it's called like The King in the Golden Mask and Other Selected Stories or something like that, right? Other writings, maybe. And it actually contains stuff from 4 different books that Schwab published during the 1890s. It contains works from Double Hearts, from The King in the Golden Mask, from, what's it called? I believe it's called Imaginary Lives, and The Children's Crusade. Now, this is a dense book. It's short. It looks short, that is to say. It looks like it's about a 200-page book, but it's very, very dense. There's a lot of short stories kind of packed into this very, very narrow space. And there's a lot of, I would say, economy of language, which makes it very impactful for the number of words that Schwab actually uses. So in this particular review, I'm only going to be talking about 2 of the books that are featured in the 1982 translation. I'm going to be talking about stories from Double Hearts and stories from The King in the Golden Mask. Double Hearts came out in 1891, a year before King in the Golden Mask. So one thing I found interesting is that Ian White decided to translate only a small fraction of the stories that are in these books. From Double Hearts, White translates The Strigae, Train 081, Arachne, The Veiled Man, A Skeleton, The Fat Man, The Dom, The Amber Trader, Merigot Marches, something like that, The Papier Rouge, I can't pronounce French, so I'll do my best, and the Firebrands. But I actually went and found a French version of Double Hearts, and these are the stories that White misses and skips. The Hoof, The 3 Customs Officers, The Fort, The Faceless Ones, The Double Man, Beatrice, Lilith, The Ports of Opium, Spiritism, On the Teeth, The Tale of the Eggs, The Sabine Harvest, The Last Night, Fanchon the Doll, Poder, which is a name, might translate to power, I'm not sure. The Wedding of Ours, For Milo, The Hospital, Heartbreak, The Wolf, The Flower of 5 Stones, Snapshots, The Terror to Come, and I just kind of Google translated all these titles. And then from The King in the Golden Mask, White translates The King in the Golden Mask, The Death of Odjigh, The Embalming Women, The Plague, The Milesian Virgins, The Sabbat at Mofflaines, Blanche the Bloody, The Flute, and The Sleeping City, but he skips The Wildfire, The Two-Faced Ones, The Eunuchs, 52 and 53 Orfila, The Speaking Machine, The Great Briere, The Salt Smugglers, The Cart, The Blue Land, The Return to the Fold, and then one that's got a name that Google translated to Crumpet, which I'm not sure about that one, and then Bargette, which seems to just be like a name or something like that. And, I was just surprised looking at the original French versions how much White decided to leave out. And I don't know, because I can't read French, whether he picked the best stuff or whether he just picked stuff and it's all that good. I don't know. So with that said, we're getting a rather, let's say, biased look at these two books, which might make them look better than they actually were in toto. But what I can say about these particular stories that Ian White translated is that they have some of the most effective visual and otherwise sensory language that I've ever seen. I'll give you an example. Quote, "We were stretched out on our couches about the sumptuously laden table. The silver lamps were burning low. The door had just closed behind the juggler, who had in the end wearied us with his trained pigs. An odor of singed skin hung about the room. Dessert was brought in, hot honey cakes and candied sea urchins, eggs wrapped in batter rissoles." The thing to pay attention to is that his language is very specific and very descriptive with a good economy of words. He doesn't talk about the table and then say, oh yes, and also the table was sumptuously laden. He just calls it a sumptuously laden table. And by putting these words together in close proximity, you get a lot of very kind of dense effects of kind of perception in the reader, at least I did. I consider it very, very well written. And, it's possible that Ian White has added something to it or taken something away from it by his translation. But as I was reading this, the language was so interesting to me that I went and found a little guide on how to read a little bit of French kind of thing, and was looking at that a little bit, maybe I should learn some French to continue to actually read the stories that haven't been translated. I mean, considering how much Ian White missed, these books are a huge opportunity for someone who is fluent in both French and English to republish them in a more complete form, and I think there could be something good for that for somebody who wants to do it. There's all kinds of scenes where Schwob says things in a few words where he could have used a lot more. Another example, quote, "A blue obscurity now hung between the upholstered benches, now and then barely broken by the veil of yellow light projected from without by an oil lamp." I just think it's really well done. So another interesting point about this book is that it really does focus on short stories. There's practically nothing more than 4 or 5 pages in this book. And that includes the stuff that comes later on from the later books. I looked at them, but I didn't read them. At that point, I had read so much and had so many things to say that I was like, I should probably, stop here, and maybe I'll do the other 2 books worth of short stories in a second part. Most of these stories have a very strong theme of being about death, or about things that are around or about death. The biggest exception is probably The Fat Man, a Parable, which doesn't actually talk about death, but does talk about people kind of wasting away, either from too much plenty or too little. And another element that Schwob uses to very strong effect is callbacks to older times. He brings us to ancient Egypt. He brings us to ancient Rome or Greece. He brings us to Plague-era Italy. He brings us to 15th century France. He, despite the fact that this was written at the end of the 1800s, he's hearkening back in a lot of ways, which gives the stories an especially kind of an antiquated feel, as well as a bit of that kind of mysterious fantasy that we get in older stuff, where we don't really know, where history might be a little bit more unsure. We'll put it that way. Now, while the style of the book is rather antiquated, the translation is very modern. Ian White finished it in 1982. 5 of the stories were translated in 1980. So you don't get a lot of, you would call them, it's not performative in the sense that White is deliberately putting difficult or archaic language in the book, but rather that the kind of tone and style itself is archaic, and though it is portrayed with modern words. One really important and unique aspect of these stories, in Double Hearts especially, but also somewhat in The King and the Golden Mask, is that there really isn't like a moral or a message or something like that in general in these stories. They're not. It's something that writers, myself included, have a tendency to do. Like, we'll think of something to illustrate, right? A point to illustrate, and then kind of the story will spring up around that. But then there will be stories where, even though maybe the theme or the lesson or the message wasn't necessarily intended, still a clear message kind of appears throughout the course of a story. That's also common, right? But in these stories, there's a lot of things where he's just describing a series of weird and interesting events in very vivid detail, and there's not necessarily like a psychology behind it, or it doesn't feel like there is. We're seeing something that happened, and Schwob is portraying it to us in an unjudgmental way, if that makes sense. We get stories about murders and things like that where, it's just kind of how things were back then, kind of thing. And I thought that was really interesting, and something that is worth, practicing as an author. Just don't necessarily have kind of like an arc in mind of a story, but just write about some events. Like that's the other thing that was kind of missing, right? Sometimes you expect a story to have an arc, right? Where you start with the introduction, and then the tension rises, and then there's a climax, and then there's a denouement and all that good stuff, right? But these stories often are just like, they feel like they're snipped out of a larger arc, and where the arc might have done this, we're only getting the part that does this, but because it's over such a short period, it may as well be flat, kind of thing. It's a really interesting feel to these stories that was unlike a lot of things that I've read. It's very hard to describe, honestly. It's unlike anything that I've read in a while. Even Lovecraft has some kind of a message, right, about like decadence or the value of a dream quest kind of thing. And in this book, even though you get a dream quest, there's no obvious like, oh yes, and this is the good thing about dream quests kind of thing. I mean, another way to put it, I guess, I wrote it down here in my notes, is that they're very vivid but short and simple stories without really like a common framing. There's no clear moral, there's no clear protagonist, antagonist, or messaging in most of these stories. There's just stuff that happens, and there's weirdness to it, and it works really well while not following the same kind of structure that you expect from stories, even short stories. Which isn't to say that the stories aren't structured, but they often feel like a snippet of another larger story with an ending that doesn't seek unnaturally to satisfy the reader. Instead of providing a conclusion, you get an ending. And then the ending leaves more questions for the reader to kind of wonder about. And I think that's an interesting technique as well. There's a lot of focus on recollections, or a character who's recounting a strange tale to the reader. And in these cases, the person recounting the tale is not simply a narrator, but is actually a participant in the story. That also, I think, was done very, very well. Now, compared to the Double Hearts section of the book, the Golden Mask stories are a little bit more conventional. They're closer to having consistent morals or lessons. But all in all of these stories kind of have these weird, often hallucinatory narratives with tons of false or not so false question mark magic. Another thing that I found interesting about the way that Schwob writes is that he's got a very balanced feel for like paragraphs. There are lots of stories where people will have these paragraphs that go on forever, and there are lots of writers who will just really short, 1 or 2 sentence paragraphs. But Schwob is very balanced. Things kind of flow very, very seamlessly, and you get these paragraphs that are a decent length, but not too short and not too long, and not all the same length, but there's like this natural variation as well. It's kind of an interesting style. It's unconventional because it doesn't try necessarily to pull you in with like strange elements of the plot, but rather it tries to pull you in with the vividness of the imagery, of the descriptions. One of the points about this is, well, was this an influence on The King in Yellow? And I would say that aside from the weirdness of the stories, it doesn't feel like it. The King in Yellow was actually a lot more conventional than these stories. And honestly, because in The King in Yellow there were so many of those kind of historical romances put in there, The King in Yellow feels a lot less focused than this book, whereas this book is focused on giving you strange and disquieting kinds of narratives that are really, really fun to just go through, and really imaginative, and really kind of, stimulates your own imagination as well. What I will say is that it was an extremely interesting read, but also a very slow read. As I said earlier, the second half of the book has another chunk of stories from Imaginary Lives, which some people say is Schwab's best writing, and The Children's Crusade, so maybe I'll cover those in another show. But with that said, how about we move from the non-spoiler section into spoilers, and I can tell you a little bit more about each individual story. Here we go. Alright, spoilers. So I'm going to try to keep these relatively short because there's a lot of them. We'll start with the first story in the book, which is The Strigae. It is a short tale from a rich man. He's sitting in his opulent room with a bunch of partygoers with him, and he kind of starts lamenting the mortality of man and the power of witches. And he recounts a tale in which his wife, or basically dies, and he goes to kind of have a wake around her corpse, and the power of these Strigae, or they're kind of like sorceresses, basically sends him to sleep, and while he's asleep, they basically desecrate the corpse. It's fairly graphic, and it's it's impactful. And what it does is it sets the tone and atmosphere of the book. It's going to be dark. It's going to be morbid. There's going to be a lot of descriptions of death and the things that surround death, basically. I wouldn't say that I ever felt particularly grossed out by any of the descriptions in the book, but at the same time, they were effective, very effective. And again, kind of the right words at the right time with an economy of words, so that you get the understanding of what you're supposed to be seeing in your head, or hearing, or feeling, or whatever. But at the same time, it wasn't actually too intense. I don't know. It's well done in such a way that it doesn't push the reader away. It doesn't feel like it's reveling in it, I guess is the way to put it. The next story is called Train 081, and this is kind of a hallucinatory tale about a guy who's working as a watchman on a train. And there's a cholera outbreak that started in the Middle East and is spreading towards Paris. And this man happened to be on a train that was carrying a man who got sick with this cholera. It's like a special, crazy monster cholera that kills people really, really quickly, and like without much warning. And he's basically on this train heading from, I believe, Marseille to France. And, the question is this cholera going to reach France? What's going to happen? Thousands of people are dying every day. And, if this thing spreads, it could be really bad. Well, he's basically watching for a red light to tell him to stop the train. And another train comes up alongside him, but this is where we get into the hallucinatory aspect, where the other train is basically a mirror of his train and himself. And he sees the watcher on the other train go into the train, and then he starts to see through the train watcher's eyes. And it's really weird and really cool. And you question whether we're dealing with like a situation of like multiple universes kind of thing, or just an unreliable narrator, or some kind of sickness that maybe he has. Who knows? But I would say that it was a really fun, and again, very short story, very effective for its length. The next story is called Arachne. It is a self-told tale by a mad murderer who honestly doesn't seem that crazy so much as maybe possessed by a strange logic. It's got kind of a dream quest aspect to it. He is worshipping the goddess Arachne, and his plan is to go to the world of the spiders, whatever the heck that means. We get a lot of ambiguous language, and we get a lot of kind of ambiguous descriptions of events. He talks about a spider up on his ceiling, spinning a web over his eyes. He talks about the spider piercing his heart, kind of thing. And it's not clear like what exactly is happening, if anything is happening, or whether it's just really literally the ravings of a madman. But the story itself is very dark and very creepy, and yet at the same time it has a very strong, like, sentimental feeling to it, which I thought was really well done and really interesting. Yeah, again, that was a really good one too. The Veiled Man is the next story, and it's a very strange story of a train robbery / murder, where basically a guy sits down in a train with two people across from him, and one guy falls asleep, the other guy turns out the light, stabs the other guy, and then basically smears blood all over the narrator. And it's a really weird story. Like, I've told you what happened, but it doesn't do it justice. You actually need to read all the weird stuff that's going on in this guy's head as he kind of witnesses this. And it's got a feeling of like partly unreliable narrator and partly like sleep paralysis demon going on. It's really crazy. You know, you have to, when you read the story and you finish it, you kind of consider what you get if you were an outside observer of this story, and it just throws everything into chaos. Where you have this guy who's like, no, I didn't do it, I swear. You know, it was this other guy, and maybe there's like another ticket that was sold. Maybe someone witnessed 3 people in there, and then there were 2. It's weird and cool and really, really interesting. And then there's this weird aspect of like animal fur-like clothing that maybe was symbolic of something, but if it was, I didn't catch it. But it was interesting nevertheless. So that was the next one. Next up we have The Skeleton, which is an almost humorous tale of the return of an old friend, or frenemy, from the grave. This might be my favorite story in the Double Hearts set. It has a very unique tone and a very odd conclusion. And the point of this story, the kernel of it, is that some men are scarier alive than undead. And that's kind of what I'll say about that. I'll quote a line that I thought was kind of illustrative of this. Quote, "Then he took my correspondence out of my overcoat pockets and with various ironic and disobliging remarks started reading my friend's letters. Really, Bobbins the Skeleton was supportable, but dear God, the Flesh and Blood Bobbins was perfectly terrifying." Really cool story. It has a weird humor to it while still being kind of dark and like and weird in a kind of an unsettling way. So that is A Skeleton. All right, the next book, or the next story in the book, was The Fat Man, a parable. This one was actually really simple. It's actually, so basically, there's a fat man who's very happy, and he has a fat house and a fat niece, and he eats fat food, and he's kind of a happy person. And a thin man comes in and says he's a doctor, and says that there's a lot of problems with being fat. And so the fat man says, well, I don't want to have problems with my health from being fat, so help me be thin. And the thin man says, all right, I'll help make you thin. And then basically the thin man orders the fat man to give up all the things that make him happy. And then the fat man and his niece and his furniture all become thin and frail, and the thin man becomes fat. It's again got kind of a comic tone, but it's not as effective as A Skeleton was. So I don't know. This was one of the weaker stories in the collection, I thought. The next one is called The Dom, and this is a tale of a Maharaja who is intent on achieving piety and equality. This actually is a really interesting story. It's kind of got a Book of Job feel to it, honestly. Though instead of being inflicted by God, it's inflicted on himself. The Maharaja, in an effort to make himself understand, or to help himself understand kind of the plight of the poor, kind of pushes himself into the most abject wretchedness. And we develop an extremely sympathetic character in the Maharaja, which I thought was interesting and well done. And then we have a really weird and creepy conclusion as well, which I thought was also really well done. It's a story that is like a journey, right? We get a bunch of stuff about. It's even hard to describe, but it's like so short, but then so effective at the same time, and it plants out all the different points on this long journey that this Maharaja goes through in order to become more sympathetic, more pious, more loving of his fellow man, and kind of what it does to him. And he ends up kind of miserable, but at the same time, even though he's miserable, he's achieved his goals. It's a weird story, but a really good one. The next story is called The Amber Trader, and it is another really simple tale of just primitive covetousness, right? It is probably the most Stone Age tale in Double Hearts. Everything else happens in the relative, say, 500 years, in the last 500 years kind of thing. Whereas this one happens sometime way, way in the past, it feels like. And all it does is kind of depict a murder over some amber jewelry. It's dark, it's short, it's effective, it doesn't judge, really. It's just kind of like, this is what happened. And it's one of those tales that kind of sticks to you. It's like, yeah, he told me a story, but is there something I'm supposed to learn from it? And the answer might be no. It might just be like, here's an interesting idea I had for a setting in a story, and here's some events. And you don't get to see what happens, if the guy who kills the Amber Trader, gets some kind of comeuppance. You don't get to see what convinced the Amber Traders to come there in the first place, if they thought it was dangerous. It's just a really creepy and interesting story. Next we have Merigot Marches, or something like that. It is probably the most vague story of the ones that I read. And basically it's about a group of mercenaries who meet up with a guy who says, oh, I know where this particular guy who was executed or whatever left a bunch of his treasure. Let's go find that treasure, and you can dig it up, and I'll have the information, and we'll split it. And so they follow this guy to where the treasure is supposedly buried, and basically it's one of those stories where the treasure isn't there, and then there's weird, crazy ghost stuff that happens along the same side. It's vague, but it is creepy, and it's very... It feels like it has a lesson, but then it kind of doesn't. It's a really weird feeling for a story, and I enjoyed that. Maybe what it might be is that it might be some reference to a historical person or a series of events that I don't know about, just because they're some kind of obscure French history from the 1500s kind of thing, or 1400s. Or maybe there's some kind of subtle message in there that I didn't catch, but it's very unsettling and very creepy, and it just works really well, even though I felt like I didn't get it at the end. I felt like I missed something. But I went back and I looked through it a second time, and I don't feel like I was missing anything, and yet the story persists in giving me that feeling, which is in itself an interesting something that a story can do, so I thought that was kind of cool too. Next up we have the Papier Rouge, or red paper, right? It is the tale... There's a guy who basically is looking for information about some particular historical figure who was executed. The red paper is the paper on which the executioners wrote down who they executed and why, kind of thing. It's already kind of a creepy setting. But what it turns out to be is basically the tale of a gypsy woman's torture and execution ? Because what ends up happening is that she kind of has this influence on the executioner himself. It's another strange and unsettling tale of subtle sorcery that you don't even really know is there. It's, kind of witch hunts and criminals and executioners, oh my. It was another story that had some vagueness to it where I was like, oh, wait, what exactly is happening here? I had to go back and flip back and reread it and kind of think about it a little bit. And again, it was one of those stories where there's not so much like a moral of the story at the end. It's just, oh yeah, maybe she escaped, we're not sure. She was supposedly executed, and her husband was supposedly executed, but then the guy that was supposed to execute her had to be executed, and so she had some kind of effect on him. It's weird and creepy and very dark. Just, unsettling in a lot of ways. Then the final story from Double Hearts is called The Firebrands. And this is another vague story. It's basically about a bunch of swindlers who are going around in Paris, and they swindle a bunch of people, and then they get divine punishment from it. It's vague and historical. I don't know exactly what it's referring to, but at the same time, this particular story has that comedic tone again, that comedic tone resurfaces, where the swindlers themselves are pretty funny and kind of... They see themselves in a humorous way as well as their fellow man. And so it was interesting, but at the same time it was a little bit vague, and there seemed like there was some kind of historical reference that I wasn't getting. So much for that. And that was the last story that Ian White decided to translate from Double Hearts. So now we're left with the stories from The King in the Golden Mask, and we've got another handful of those to go through, so let's get to it. So the first story is, of course, The King in the Golden Mask. This is probably the longest tale of those that I've read so far. It might be the longest tale in the book. It has a very allegorical structure, if you follow what I mean. We have a king with 50 jesters and 50 priests and 50 women, and they're all masked, and they're all wearing different kinds of masks. And basically a beggar comes in and accuses them that oh yeah, the priests and the jesters are playing you for a fool, my lord. And also you're horribly ugly. It's a very weird entrance to the tale, but it leads to some really interesting stuff. Because what happens next, as you might expect, is that it turns out that the mendicant is what he's called, seems to be right. And what happens is that, in very much like the Maharaja in the Dam, the king goes on a journey of repentance and discovery. And it's a long story, so I could go on and on about it, but I'm actually deliberately skipping a bunch of it because it's really interesting to see what he does. There's a lot of inversions and very peculiar reversals of things, and a very sudden and violent move toward the conclusion that I'd prefer not to spoil, even in a spoiler section. Suffice it to say that the story is interesting. It has but it also shows that The King in the Golden Mask is going to have more of a message to it. They're not just going to be snippets of stories where you're left kind of guessing at the beginning and end, but there's actually going to be kind of a definite arc in some of these stories, more so than there were in Double Hearts. And so for that purpose, The King of the Golden Mask does a really good job of setting that kind of atmosphere and tone, where things are dark and strange and inverted from how you might expect in a lot of ways. So that's The King in the Golden Mask. Now the next story is called The Death of Odjigh, Odjigh. I'm not exactly sure how to pronounce it, but this is the story that Liminal Spaces talked about in the video that I found talking about this book. So again, here, rather than giving you the synopsis, I'll let him do it, and I'll point you toward his videos. You should give it a look if you can. It is a dark, dying Earth story with a heaping helping of ritualism that is interesting, while still feeling a little bit more surface level than stuff that we saw in Double Hearts. And it might not be an end-of-the-world story, it might be an Ice Age story, and I'm not really sure. It has a weird surprise ending that confused me and made me reread it a couple of times. But again, I'll say, if you want that synopsis of the story, go watch Liminal Space's video, and he has stuff to say about it, and it'd be the thanks for directing me toward this book in the first place. Otherwise, I would never have known it existed. The next story is called The Embalming Women, and here the stories actually start to get more, let's say, salacious. I don't know if it's just a question of what Ian White was picking to translate or not, because as I looked through Double Hearts, there were what appeared to be, salacious stories in Double Hearts, but I guess Ian White didn't really translate any of them. But here, we start to see kind of more lewd-ish content in the books, in the stories, where we have a story of two traveling brothers who stumble upon, in the desert, a village of embalming women. And we get this weird short story that involves mummification and strange occurrences and possible sorcery. The atmosphere is really strong. The series of events it's followable. It's not vague. It's not questionable, but there's a strong element of this all happened while I was asleep and dreaming, or did it, kind of aspect to it, which I found really interesting. It's a shorter story, but it's actually kind of interesting, and this is another place where the descriptions of the process of mummification are kind of graphic and a little bit, they could be a little strong for some people, but I still found it really well done. And again, not reveling in it, but just kind of describing what happened when people were mummified in, say, ancient Egypt, and what those rituals were kind of like, which was interesting, if a little bit graphic. So I'll put it that way. Next up, we have another story of divine punishment of scoundrels. We have the plague, and basically there's a plague happening in Florence in, I don't know exactly when it was, but there's two gamblers who escape, and they're like, well, we're going to go out into the countryside and gamble and win some money and, such and such and such, and we'll escape the city until everything's back to normal. Well, what happens is that they think everything's back to normal or getting there, so they return to Florence, but they basically get thrown into a dungeon. And then we get a really interesting surprise ending, which is very well described, though I would call it possibly a little bit cheap, in the sense that we find two things happening together where it's unlikely that they would have done so in the way that it's described in the story, for what it's worth. Then we have the Milesian Virgins. This is a story in ancient Greece, specifically Miletus, Miletus, Miletus. It is a story of a magic artifact and its effects on these particular people, the Virgins of Miletus. And it's kind of a story about the terror of the future and being able to see the future. What this artifact allows these girls to see scars them to the point that they no longer decide they wish to continue living. So, another story that actually has a message to it, which is different from the stuff mostly in Double Hearts. We definitely have kind of like a message or a theme or a conclusion to draw in this story. Next, we have the Sabbat at Mofflaines, which is another strange story of witchcraft. And we're left open to the possibility that this is either magic or hallucination. We just don't really know. We find some elements in the story that talk about like how witches were punished, and we get some very visceral descriptions, again, that are very strong, kind of like the Embalming Women, but kind of in a different direction as well. These are descriptions of like the reagents that go into creating a witch's brew kind of thing. But it's a weird story because in addition to the witches, we have like a guy who gets brought along on the witches' journey at the same time, and that part is kind of like, well, why did they bring him along, kind of thing? But anyway, it's a short story. It's got some interesting descriptions to it, and it was decent, but not one of my favorites that I've read so far. Next up, we have Blanche the Bloody, which is another strange story. It's about a young wife that was taken by a guy named Guillaume de Flavy. I don't know who that is, probably a historical character of some sort. But we get themes of like the corruption of the beautiful and the decadence of the noble, because this woman Blanche that is taken by Guillaume de Flavy is seen as like a corrupt, not very good guy, and Blanche is seen as beautiful and kind of innocent until de Flavy takes her as his wife, and then she basically devolves into kind of the worst of both worlds. She no longer has the physical beauty, and her heart also gets corrupted as well. And then that kind of works its way into a plot that some people have against de Flavy, and we get this very strange and unsettling story that while it wasn't the most kind of complex thing in the world, it did a really good job of being unsettling and kind of disturbing, honestly. It doesn't have like the visceral descriptions that some of these other stories have, but just the atmosphere and the way that things are put together and the way that things proceed in the story is very unsettling and not cheerful, I guess I'll say. Everyone loses in this story. Next up, and we're almost done, we have The Flute, in which pirates are shown the ultimate terror and the error of their ways by kind of an oracle-like figure. Basically, they're on a boat, they've just taken a bunch of other boats, and they have a bunch of rum and dead bodies around them and everything, and they've come across an old man floating in a canoe with a flute. And basically, they bring the man onto their boat, and he plays the flute. And if you've ever read the Silmarillion, right? Of course, that came a lot later, but, Tolkien was working with real mythical ideas. So, in the Silmarillion, the what's his name? Eru sings, and he creates a song, and the other creatures that he's creating add to the song. And there's like 3 stages where the first song is beautiful, and then some discordant notes come in, and Eru stops it, and then restarts it, and now it's still beautiful, but a little bit different. There's something minor key about it, if you will. And so he stops it again, and starts it again, and now there's even more chaos and stuff going on, and that's kind of the end of the song portion at the beginning of that book. In the same way, in this book, the flute song has 3 distinct effects on these pirates. First it shows them kind of, I didn't write it down, but there are 3 different effects, and like it's like, we see the good for us of what's been done, we see the bad to others of what's been done, and we see the bad of our future. It's something like that. I might be a little bit off on that description, but basically they discover that the strange man with the flute music has kind of given them both a curse and a prophecy at the same time, that none of them shall ever hear the crying of a newborn baby. And the question is it? And the narrator says yes, but he's not dead yet, I guess. But like the point is that they've been so tainted by their life of murders that they're never going to be able to come back to a happy, normal life and have a wife and kids kind of thing. And, isn't that a shame? And so they throw him over they throw his flute over the side, and then he dies instantly. Just a weird story, very creepy, but also very well written, and of the stories that have a message, I'd say this is one of the better ones, the more subtle ones, because it's just interesting the way he does it. And finally, we have The Sleeping City, which is a story, and it seems like it's the only story in this collection that has a book found opening. Like, there was that House on the Borderlands thing where they found a manuscript. And this actually starts like that. Well, we found a book with a wooden cover, partly jammed into sand, and this is what the book said. And basically, it's another pirate story. We get a bunch of pirates that stumble onto this ancient abandoned city, and we get this very cosmic horror kind of thing going on, where they're basically driven mad by the silence kind of thing. It's not quite as subtle as a lot of the other stories, but it does really feel like kind of an early Lovecraft kind of story, a cosmic horror, something great that was brought back to nothingness, and modern people examining this thing that was great and being driven mad as a result of discovering this thing that should never have been discovered again. Very good little story, although very different from a lot of the other stuff in these collections that I've read. So with that said, I've talked a little bit about each one of the stories in these first two books that were translated, and now we'll get on to the conclusion and we'll finish this up. Here we go. In conclusion, even through a translator, I can tell that this book is excellently written. It has a very old-style tone with a modern language translation, which is kind of the best of both worlds. We don't have to worry about dialects and all that stuff, or, what Prithi means, but we do get a lot of that really old-school kind of description of things, where adjectives and nouns and verbs are chosen very carefully with the kind of care that you often don't see these days, where like, oh, this is just kind of, and it's not that modern authors care less, but it's just that kind of style of writing has kind of gone out of vogue, if you will. Considering how good a lot of these stories are, it's a pity that we missed so many of them. White translated less than half of Double Hearts and about half of The King in the Golden Mask. So, what did we miss? Did we miss stuff that was just as good as what we've seen, or did we miss stuff that was much less good? Which are both possibilities, and since I can't read French, I just don't know. These stories are cryptic, they're horrific, they're dark, they're strange, they're mystical. They don't push you in any particular direction. They show the darkness in the human soul without, judging it in a way. If you read French, go check out the original books, because you might really, really find them interesting. And, if you are both a native level speaker in French and English, you might find that these books are worthy of full translation, or at least an English review by someone who is a careful reading of the French versions. Because there's just so much that I missed. I don't know whether I missed good stuff or whether I missed mediocre stuff or what. Because you can think of it, you can color it both ways if you're a translator. You can say, oh, I like this story. Of these stories, there are 10 that I really like, and 4 that I kind of like, and 3 that I don't like. And so I'm going to pick proportionally from these groups, so that the reader of the translated version gets a fair representation. Or you can say, these are my 7 favorite stories, and so here's what I'm going to translate. And those are both, I think, valid approaches, but at the same time, they make it hard to tell whether the entirety of those books in French are as good as the English versions, or whether we just got the best stories and, Schwob was good, but not as great as this selection of stories, suggests. So that's what I got for today. It was a really good book. I'll have links in the description for where you can go read a copy of this on the Internet Archive. As usual, there will be links in the description to help support the channel if you want. And of course, as this is YouTube, all the regular stuff that you can do. Thanks for anything that happens, and thanks for watching. And have a great week, and I'll see you next time.